On August 13, 2000, WCW presented New Blood Rising from Vancouver. To this day, this remains one of the most infamous WCW events ever, thanks to the booking ideas of Vince Russo, who by this point had well established his New Blood vs Millionaires Club storyline. This event took place in front of just over 6,000 fans, a far cry from a few years ago, when an episode of Nitro could draw 40,000 to the Georgia Dome. WCW was well and truly on the decline at this point. For comparison, just 2 weeks later, WWF drew 17,000 for their SummerSlam event. In the opening match, the boy band inspired 3 Count and their new bodyguard Tank Abbott would defeat the Young Dragons, Kaz, Jamie-san and Yang. For those who might not know, Jamie and Yang would later be known as Jamie Noble and Jimmy Yang, with Noble even eventually becoming a Ring of Honor World Champion. On the other side of this match, Shane Helms would later become the Hurricane. Tank Abbott was a real-life fighter with an 8-6 MMA record in the early years of UFC. For most of his WCW run, he was portrayed as a heelish bully until Vince Russo laid eyes on him. In February of 2000, when Chris Benoit left and vacated the world title, Vince planned for Tank Abbott to win the title in a battle royal. An idea deemed so ridiculous that it led to his instant removal from the writing team for 3 months. Upon his return, Russo had other ideas for Tank, pairing the tough guy up with the cheesy pop group, turning him into the worst cheerleader since George Bush Jr. Many pay-per-views around this time started with an exciting cruiserweight match. Unlike any other opener, however, this was a double ladder match. Hanging above the ring were 2 of 3 Count's prized possessions, a golden record and a recording contract. The weirdness doesn't end here, as this match starts with 2 legal men, 4 on the apron and a chain wrestling sequence. This doesn't last long though, as all 6 make a mad dash for the ladder. What follows is a fun cruiserweight match that would sadly be outdone by the first ever TLC match, which took place 2 weeks later at SummerSlam. Jamie-san managed to retrieve the gold record, but before he could reach the floor, he dropped it and it was caught by Abbott. And the recording contract was won by Evan Courageous, giving 3 Count the win. Post-match, Tank Abbott celebrated, leaving with both items, with 3 Count left confused in the ring. But who's going to argue with Tank Abbott? Third on the card, Buff Bagwell would defeat Chris Kanyon in the historic Judy Bagwell on a forklift match. Buff's real-life mother had been a part of WCW storylines before, but this is the one she's most remembered for, in which she was kidnapped by Kanyon and Buff would have to win this match to gain her back. Kanyon at the time was playing Positively Kanyon, openly attempting to steal the act of his former friend Diamond Dallas Page, coming out to Page's music, and even dyeing his hair blonde for the storyline. As a side note on the Bagwells, Lance Storm once detailed in an RF video shoot interview that one of the reasons that Buff Bagwell didn't last long in WWE was that Judy acted effectively as Buff's agent and would call the WWE offices with often ridiculous demands. Jim Ross, who would have headed talent relations at the time, has confirmed this also. The reason Judy was held on a forklift was that the match had been advertised as Judy Bagwell on a pole, but they couldn't find a way to make that work. Kanyon even notes in his pre-match promo that he searched the whole of Canada and couldn't find a pole big enough. Pre the opening bell, the 2 brawl into the crowd, and I wonder if production knew about this, as the camera had a hard time following the action. The match itself was a near 7-minute, fairly regular match, until Kanyon uses a pair of clippers to remove the turnbuckle padding. By this time, WCW had relaxed its rules similar to ECW. DQs were so rare now that the referee just allowed this to happen. This would come back to bite Kanyon though, as it would be him who would hit the exposed buckle. After this, DDP's music would hit again, this time for former world champion David Arquette to enter the ring. to try and assist Positively Canyon. Buff would eventually overpower them both, and would win the match after hitting the blockbuster on both of them. He then got to lower Judy back to the ground and celebrate with his mother. Another side note here, Judy Bagwell would before this be a one-time WCW Tag Team Champion. With her son? No, don't be silly. With Rick Steiner, of course. Later in the night, the valet of the Misfits in Action, Major Guns, defeated Miss Hancock, later known as Stacy Keibler, in a rip-off the camouflage match, which despite the name, could only be won by pinfall. A mud pit was placed beside the entranceway for this match, a gimmick nobody ever seems to yearn for to be brought back these days. The announcers kept teasing that the match had to end in the mud, but pins were counted way before they even made it to the pit, which made this even more confusing. This was a match between two non-trained professional wrestlers, so it was never going to be a 5-star classic, but it would end in booking tragedy. In the middle of the match, Hancock took a kick to the abdomen, after which Hancock would repeatedly grab her stomach. Once the match made it into the mud pit, Hancock would keel over clutching her stomach, and Guns would pin her for the win. Hancock would continue to sell until it became apparent she needed medical help. Her real-life partner, David Flair, would run out to assist her, and she would be stretchered out of the arena. On this night, it was left a mystery as to why, but it would later transpire that Hancock in storyline had been pregnant and had suffered a 1 year previously, Vince Russo had booked a similar storyline on Raw with Terry Runnels, both times drawing disgust from both fans and staff members alike. Jim Cornette over the years has many times expressed his hatred for these angles, expressing his concern for any viewer who faced a similar tragedy in their own lives who would be affected by it. Thankfully, stories like this seem to have been left behind in the Attitude Era. Moving on from this, in the 8th match of the card, Lance Storm would defeat Mike Awesome in a Canadian Rules match for the United States title. Lance Storm had entered WCW a little over a month earlier, and had already won the United States, Cruiserweight and Hardcore Championships. He would later give 2 of these away after forming Team Canada, but here he had redecorated all 3 belts with the Canadian flag, making him a hero to this Canadian crowd. He even received a Goldberg-style walk backstage to the ring, and a full rendition of the Canadian national anthem, making his hero's welcome even more jarring with what we were about to see. This would become one of the most bafflingly booked matches in WCW history, with Mike Awesome defeating Storm on 3 separate occasions, only for guest outside the ring referee Jacques Rougeau to restart the match based on the Canadian rulebook he was referring to. Awesome would first beat Storm by pinfall, only for Rougeau to declare that you had to achieve a 5 count to win. Awesome would then win again by submission, leading Rougeau to declare that you can't win a title match by submission in Canada, a rule that must have been brought in after Montreal. Awesome would then win again, this time winning a 5 count, but Rougeau disallowed it, because following a 5 count, a man had a 10 count to stand up and resume the match, last man standing style. After both men crashed through a table together, Rougeau announces seemingly at random that the man who beat the 10 count standing up would be the winner. He then enters the ring and decks Mike Awesome, allowing Storm up to achieve the win in front of a completely confused crowd. Ideally, Lance would have been the heel in this situation, but the crowd loved him, making all of this feel really strange. Post-match, Bret Hart, who by this point had retired from the ring and looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world, made a cameo to give Lance Storm his seal of approval. In 2001, Chris Jericho and William Regal would have a similar match, known as the Duchess of Queensberry Rules, in which the titular Duchess would alter the rules to favour Regal at every turn until he got the win. This at least made a fraction more sense, with Regal getting the hatred of the crowd for his blatant cheating. In the semi-main event, Kevin Nash would defeat Scott Steiner and Goldberg in a match filled with work-shoot mess. In storyline, Goldberg didn't arrive to the building until near the beginning of the match, and the announcers were playing up an alleged motorcycle accident. The implication behind this was that Goldberg had been too unprofessional to show up on time, but he was being covered for by the announcers. This was negated during Nash's entrance, as Tony Schiavone and Scott Hudson openly discussed who would go over, an inside term not commonly used by fans at this point. One often used criticism of Vince Russo is that he seemed to assume that everybody was on the internet reading the backstage gossip. Therefore everyone knew what all these terms meant, which just wasn't true in 2000. Sure, a portion of fans did, but there were many casual fans who didn't know or care about the inside of the business. After Nash and Steiner made their entrance, Goldberg's music plays and he doesn't show up. Mark Madden on commentary questions if they're trying to show Goldberg up, implying that there's more going on that we don't know about. After Goldberg's music hit a second time, the match starts with Nash and Steiner having to work a singles match. A few minutes in, Goldberg runs in with a chair and tape around his waist. The match proceeds seemingly normally until Nash attempts to set Goldberg up for a powerbomb. Goldberg backs out and walks out of the match completely. Vince Russo stands on the ramp shouting at Goldberg to get back to the ring, but Goldberg cusses him out and walks away. The announcers play this up as Goldberg refusing to follow the script, using many of the insider terms not all fans were yet familiar with. They implied that Nash was supposed to win with the jackknife powerbomb, but now he and Steiner were having to improvise a finish, and after a few minutes, Nash would get the win, and the two were complimented for finding a new way out. In truth, all of this went according to plan, but it was a really terrible plan. It's now time for the main event, as Jeff Jarrett challenged the WCW World Champion, Booker T. This was a result of the controversial events of Bash at the Beach 2000, where Russo had convinced Jeff Jarrett to lay down for Hulk Hogan, humiliating him in the process. Later in the night, after Hogan had left, Russo booked a new World Championship match, as Jarrett would again lose, this time to Booker T, who Russo saw as a deserving new champion. In the year 2000, the WCW World title changed hands or was vacated 25 times, and Booker's reign represented a 50-day rare period of stability amidst chaos. On this night, Booker would defeat Jarrett in a fine 15-minute match that is largely forgotten due to the booking atrocities that took place earlier in the night. As soon as Booker T raised the world title, the show ended, and you could noticeably see fans flooding out of the arena. The more famous Booker vs Jarrett match would happen on the October 2nd Nitro, the San Francisco 49ers match, where the world title was placed in one of 4 boxes in the corners of the ring, essentially turning the world title match into a guessing game of chance. New Blood Rising as a whole is looked back on as one of the very worst events of WCW and of 2000, and a far cry from its better years when they were legitimately number one. For me, it's kind of sad to watch this event knowing the heights that they were sinking from, and knowing how much lower they would eventually go. After all, pretty soon, Vince Russo would be champion. Thank you for watching yet another wrestling channel. If you enjoyed this, please comment, like or subscribe.